Okay, so yeah, Nick Mulgrew is reading for us tonight, which is a real honor. He's a very well accomplished poet and writer. I really enjoyed your novel, Hibiscus Coast, and you obviously do, or Nick obviously does amazing work publishing many of our favorite poetry collections via Uhlanga Press. And we are excited about his newest volume that will be coming out fairly soon. It's called The Book of Unrest. And I'm sure we're going to get a little taste for that and no doubt add it to our to-buy list following tonight. Over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for the kind introduction. And thank you to everyone who's here virtually in this space. I always like reading with the Red Wheelbarrow. It's such a committed and friendly group of people who enjoy poetry. And I think, at least in South Africa, that's where our best sort of poetry comes from. As for me, I'm not sure it is that best poetry, but let's see how it goes. Tonight I'm reading from my second book. It's called The Book of Unrest. And it should have started to appear in shops on Tuesday, but my mum went to the shop this week to the exclusives, and it wasn't there. So who knows? You know, it's a bit like spring. You try to wonder when the flowers will show up, and then they just show up when they do. So the book will be where it will be eventually. I suppose I should introduce these poems in some way, because I'm not sure I'm going to be giving many readings of these poems at readings in South Africa for various reasons, mostly because I'm here in Scotland, which rather complicates that somewhat. But also because these books come out of a very particular time. These poems come out of a very particular time of my life when I was really not so sure what the point of my writing or the point of very much of what I was doing, including living itself. I wasn't really too sure of what the point was, I suppose. And at the time I was writing a lot of fiction, as I always do, but my poetry was kind of a space for me to really interrogate very deep, very knotted questions, to which I realized pretty early on that there probably would be no way of answering. So instead of trying to describe these poems, I'm going to just read a selection of them from this book. It's quite a thin book, but you'll see that the poems are quite dense. I hope not impenetrable, but well, we'll see. We'll see. I'm going to start with the first poem in the book, which is called Dramatis Personae. And it gives some of the themes of selfhood and etc. that we're going to explore tonight. So I hope you enjoy these poems. I'm going to just mostly read them sequentially. And if you have any questions or anything afterwards, please, feel free to ask me any question as silly or inane or complicated or as difficult as you want. But let me start with Dramatis Personae. This person who is formed from other people. Where must I slouch when the others go off to sleep, or to myth? When the book is forgotten and couched in rows of bending shelves, deep within or out with. Inside myself is a lonely place. It is better to know myself through a self, faced with the pressure under which it must liquefy or shatter. Most of a poem is words, in the way I am mostly water, not the part that matters. Most of these poems in this book are set in Durban, which over the past couple of years has endured a number of disasters. Hence the Book of Unrest, but I'll come to that later when I'm discussing a different poem. But this poem is set and is mostly about Durban and nostalgia. And it's called Ode to a Time and Place that is not this time and place. And it starts with a rather long quote from Imran Kavadia from Tales of the Metric System, which is quoted as follows. He loved the climate and yearned for it away from Durban. It made certain philosophies impossible to maintain, after all. Sartre and de Beauvoir, Claude Levi-Strauss, and others from the Sorbonne wrote about the tropics, investigated their sad condition, proclaimed on their behalf, classified and determined the varieties of tropical consciousness. But they never could have prospered, burned through so many cigarettes, and composed their endless volumes at 100% humidity. The hot form of life, the existence inside the body, precluded the other form. 1. A new message instance on the Moniteur you de Gauze for fun. The pixels rummed and swaying like the palms outside, where none of your attention lies. You can't hear the song, but you know its key and modem hum like a lost father's voice. Lilac clouded, you type to a girl until the morning rises like damp. The air conditioner wakes. Shrieking, the neighbor begins her daily engagement with the criminal vervets, their long furred fingers already slick with molten Swiss truffles. Snake-tongued, the pitchfork's twines peek through the frame of the bedroom window. 2. Disquiet, restlessness, or unrest, what does it matter? The sky hangs milky with the char of fields and factories. The sea froths brown, the estuary glows blue. Chemicals candlelit, plume over hill. Difference lives between each defeated morning spent scrubbing the veranda tiles. This was fields years ago, which used to be forest, which will be again. The water carries dirt and soap and evaporates. Bled out, the Songololo hose now curls. Or is it the mamba as it unfurls in green spitting fear? The creepy crawly heartbeat drives you back inside, where there are no eyes but yours. Standing by the pantry, skin radiant and radioactive, ye eat tinned guavas and cold ultramel. The empty bowl slips, yellow wet, and shatters. A raised hand can shush either a yawn or a yelp. 3. Who would leave Durban? The man who left Durban asks, about all the men who left Durban to fulfill uncertain tasks. The sun is a cartouche without graven name or image. God, what is in this strange heat? The distant siren, a lineage of moans. The breath of a world with spiders in its lungs. I traveled home to Durban about a week after the floods in April of this year. And although there are great flying over Durban after the floods was quite a sensation, and looking at the hills and the way in which parts of the hills had fallen away, it was almost as if the hills had these kind of stretch marks or things like that. But the main thing that really took my notice was the way the ocean looked after the flood. And this is a poem called Subsidence, and it's subtitled North Coast, April 2022. Receding now, The floodwater masquerades as ocean. Every day, the intertide rises further, approaching the horizon in a parallel band. The coast is leaking gray. Even the dullest shades of blue desert the ruined bay. We are surrounded by our surroundings. The foundations now walls, the walls something else. Rubble cairns briskly masoned and idle. Memorials of brick immemorial. Mangled fingers of rebar grasp from a rain-quarried hill to the taunt of a fresh sanded sky. A jumbo rakes by, banking west, then north, to another where, another why. If you read my last book, which I very snappily named The Myth of This Is That We're All in This Together, which came out in 2015. And I always felt a bit weird during the pandemic when people always said, oh, we're in this together and stuff, seeing as I'd written this. But if you'd read this book, you'd know that there was a listicle poem and it's about veggie burgers for sale in the Cape Town City Bowl. This one is another listicle, and it's a listicle of the top 5 places in South Africa the people should expropriate. Which is kind of a funny thing because I'm currently reading a book called Do South Africans Exist? And it complicates the idea of a people. It's by Ivor Chipkin. It was published by Wits University Press a while ago. Anyway, so what is a people? Who knows? Who can say? But this is what they should expropriate. And this poem begins with a quote from Richard Turner, who obviously a very famous political theorist, I suppose you'd call him, from Durban. And the quote, he's quoted as saying, "Unless we can see our society in the light of other possible societies, we cannot even understand how and why it works as it does, let alone judge it." This listicle counts down from 5. Number 5 is Sun City, Northwest. There's an advert at the Kloof Street Seaf. Sol Kersner selling off some real estate near Hout Bay. Another small lion's head in and of the sun. Obviously, he's worried about Black people taking it. Regardless, it's insane for someone to own a mountain nowadays, isn't it? So I say let's go further. Forget boycott breakers, they're lapping pretenders in the lost city. What has homeland gambling wrought but promise and bankruptcy? The protest single, Bruce Springsteen sweating in the velodrome, prodding queens for stalking the Pilansberg's buck. To atone, 10,000 whiteys shuffle on the bridge of time, while the players walk on another course. But there is a better line toward the resolution of this simulated history. 1,000 hotel rooms occupied by the poor, unlost and free. 4. Every Airbnb in Cape Town. This old mosque has been renovated to a luxury spec, including a rainwater shower in the steeple and solar panels. What do you mean, minaret? Wealth is, as we've seen, power over other people. 3. Ex-presidential homesteads. The further you go, the further it stays away. Peace and freedom are as far as the next town from Ulundi. But here, between the purple of sunset and in the haze of the morning that you leave, it's easy to believe the crests of these hills mark the borders of all existence. Save your gaze from the new castle on the way out. Children and cattle still walk on the roads. 2. All the land held by the Ngonyama Trust. You risk nothing, and yet you don't risk it. A circular tour circumscribes all that they haven't. It's too difficult to dream when you're afraid of your own face, ashen, as the cowards amass on feed and talkingly talk on radio, towing the line they suspended over the ravine they call plateau. Meanwhile, you twiddle your thumbs on the glass and push the teeth around your plate. Oh, I suppose something should be said here, but I'm not the one to say it. And one, the entire country. It's all very fun until you get held to account, because who doesn't dream themselves accountable until it actually starts to count? So obviously the Book of Unrest references the unrest that happened. Unrest in Durban. Can't we just call it what I call it? I mean, there was political interference, which then stemmed riots and also, shall we say, redistribution on behalf of Durban's many impoverished and desperate residents. The thing that bothered me mostly about the unrest was the ways in which people's lives were very, commentators, especially journalists, politicians, were very keen to narrativize what was happening, almost as or before it was happening. And this to me felt, how should I say, wrong on a number of levels, because it completely ignored the suffering that people were going through at that time. And the greatest, one of the big symbols of this for me was the children who died under the bridge at Queen Nandi Drive, which, if you've been to Durban, you'll know is quite a large, I suppose, arterial road that goes throughout an industrial estate, and that connects many different parts of Durban and goes over a lot of roads, a lot of paths. But these children died and were left under a bridge, and nobody attended to them for a few days, or at least overnight. I can't remember now. It was, yeah, a difficult time. Anyway, so this is a poem for two boys who died under Queen Nandi Drive. And it starts with a quote from Ronnie Govender's poem 1949. And it quotes simply, "All mercy deserted them." It was for the sake of TVs, the security guard said, that thousands emerged from the corrugated hills. It was late when the largest warehouse exploded. The size of the smoke plume could only be known by the orange flame that rose beneath it, a new bloom in the valley's cut palms that grew as large as the eyes that bore its witness. The detritus left after our small apocalypse was as meaningful as an 8-day week. Powder and soil, cardboard spontaneously confettied, overturned containers, their slack jaws picked clean. In the floral kingdom of plastic bags, the high-vis vests recover first, germinating on the bridge that still stood, despite the protestations of those who stood on it. Forget the two boys who lie under that loose and concrete blanket. Remember, it was for TVs that they came, so someone had said. And because it was such a simple thing for which they had come, it was one also to overlook them among the carrion of cold chain centers and the rib cages of factories, things that someone still cared for. But only things are still, and still things are. parentless mannequins discarded outside the city's ransacked shopfront. How naive it is to expect care in death when there is no care in life. Sanctified, the sweeping brooms sweep out the remains of things, earned or interred in mind. Ash is only dust with provenance. And this next poem is called Prayer. Sea cloud, pension tide, you wait for me, and under your blanket it is warm. The dark focuses the eye to where it is not. Ships seam through the velvet pulled taut. Air drunk, the moon stays on its side of the bed. How do we all fit here in fitful sleep? Even the earth contracts as it cools. The car lamps, open shuttered, stream eternally across the coast's vision. Ghostly, seafoam cavalry pound the waves into mist. I'll read two more poems to finish off, one long one and one very short one. The second part of the title, The Book of Unrest, actually has to do with a book by possibly Durban's most famous writer, or the most famous writer who was raised in Durban, which is Fernando Pessoa, the Portuguese poet, writer. He lived in Durban for most of his childhood and, like me, left when he was 17. And that's where the comparisons end. But the title of the Book of Unrest is also somewhat a reference to Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet, which was a book that he wrote throughout his life, and sometimes very short, but also quite long vignettes. And scholars debate what the assemblage or the ordering of these vignettes should be. But it was a book that when I read and reread it, it got to a question that I was having in me over the past few years, where things just continued to happen to me in a way that I couldn't quite, I suppose, deal with, or compartmentalize or process. And there's this part in the Book of Unrest where the narrator says that I've looked at my life as if it is some kind of congenital drunkenness, that I was there, but I wasn't there entirely, which is this kind of strange thing about our lives, in which we often witness things and bear witness to things that we are both totally unprepared for, and yet we must somehow prepare for them after the fact. Or maybe not prepare, but deal with it in some way. Some people would call that trauma, but I'm not too sure it's that easy a definition. But anyway, this is a poem in 4 parts, but I'll read the first 3. And yeah, it's titled Dogma, and it has 2 opposing quotes that to begin with. The first is from Douglas Livingstone's Blue Stuff, which is quote, "Somewhere space unfurls its furnished seasons," which is replied to by Alberto Caeiro, which is one of the characters that Pessoa wrote as. The quote is, "But where in the end the stars are nothing but stars." 1. Religion is a metaphor for existence, just as I am for myself, a clear sky over the ocean for breath. But the air is never clear in Durban, is it? I swim out to the shark nets and turn in the warm water to look back. And over the city and over my berth is a grey-brown pole, transparent and agitated as it is below. What fish are caught in the nets tickling at my toes? I cannot know from what I'm protected or what is killed in my name. And yet I have spent my life in this water, dreaming of the welcome pull, of its warm and grey-bound transparency, all those Sundays, rash vests, and 2-liter Coke bottles filled to the brim with foam, wide-throated and regurgitated whole back into the foamed waves from which they were pulled. In the rock pools, a child nets for minnows. She takes them home in a plastic cup and watches them swim until they die. 2. I saw the face of Christ in the soft silt left by the flood in my parents' kitchen. The week after a man wrapped a brick from our crumbling boundary wall in a beach towel we had left on the washing line and smashed a window pane. And upon hearing the alarm which we had only last week learned how to activate, slashed himself on the glass, leaving a trail of his blood into the living depths of the garden. The floods were fast and sullen. This isn't a metaphor. This is just the way floods are. My parents and I took up brooms. Scrapping, they swept the brown-grey rain out the garage. I round the back, purged rain into the pool, which then overflowed and pushed itself back. The next morning, I spent the sunlight picking up weavers' nests and palm fronds from the lawn. At the pool's bottom lay 2 small white eggs. One was whole, the other whole, its insides chalk bleached and clean as my 9-year-old soul. I buried them both in the soft brown loam under the lemon tree with the bodies of my parrots. The lemon tree bore no fruit. The water had made the earth soft as last. So after the man bled in the garden, our neighbors installed metal spikes in the mulch on their side of the boundary wall, hidden from sight by the trees they called theirs. Of course, I only discovered this fact when I hit an old tennis ball for 6 into their circumscribed square of brown loam, and jumping the wall, missed every point by about the length of the line of a poem. This, I must repeat, isn't metaphor. This is not something to ascribe a meaning to. This is just what happens. 3. It is refusal we all practice. Waterproof skin, dark thoughts in our pith. All of ourselves are intentional, constructed from memory, myth, and ash, crossed onto the hot forehead of a child who does not yet know what sin is. Not to speak of memory or myth, only the shark, caught and gut on a steel table in the baking sun, while the sugarcane burns around him. He does not yet know that his home and garden are built on the soft ground named for the son of a man who brought over the ancestors of his neighbors from their own home and sullen coast to plant and tend these acres. Where would heaven be if heaven had a view of hell? This is what happens when we make meaning of ourselves. And one last poem. It's very short, as I promised. It's titled Draft. Later, he wrote, rewriting is unwriting, and a moment later rewrote it. Writing is unwriting. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening and being here.
Thank you. Everyone, if you want to unmute yourselves to clap for Nick, welcome to.
Sorry, stop.
Thank you.
Oh no.
It's always very strange reading poems for the first time, I suppose. Thank you, Erin. That's very nice. It's, yeah, I don't really get a chance to read very much over here in Scotland, so it's nice to be able to do this.
We're very happy to give you this opportunity.
Thank you.
We will open the floor up for questions. So anyone who wants to ask something of Nick, of the writing of these poems, of his writing process in general, anything at all, you're welcome to raise a hand on Zoom or put your name in the chat or put a question in the chat or just wave wildly at me at some point. And we'll try and get to whoever wants to ask something. And Jacques is always the quickest one on the trigger, so he can start it off.
Oh, I didn't think I would be. Nick, it's great. It's great to hear these poems. I've heard some of them before, and they really stand up to repeated listenings, hearings. There's a beautiful paradox at the heart of this book for me, and you spoke about it a bit. And that on the one hand, there's a kind of despair in many of the poems, as if you're questioning what is the, why are we doing anything? But at the same time, there's this incredible, very attractive rage that comes from imagining different worlds. I feel it very, very strongly in the poem about the fence. I feel it very strongly in the top 5 places to appropriate. I don't know if you want to say something about that paradox, because that's really a hinge for me into the whole book.
Thanks, Jacques. Yeah, I think you've very astutely identified the two emotions that went mostly into writing this book. Despair and rage as a hinge. It's difficult because I started writing some of these poems, I'd say, in about 2016. And then the last one that I wrote for the book was Subsidence, just as I was finishing the book off. And during those years, I've experienced a lot of, how should I say, I wouldn't call it personal growth, but I would maybe call it a renewed approach to myself and my character and my emotions. And these poems for a while were, I suppose, a way of dealing with these two irreconcilable feelings. One of the quite deep anger. I think at the uncaring nature of the society that I grew up in, not entirely, not in totality, and not even probably in reality. It's a vastly uncaring society, but not in the sense where it's like, oh, nobody cares about anyone, but the lack of, I suppose, care. And I don't always like to fall back on this concept, but the concept of a kind of Christian love, which is a doing thing, which is often a political thing, often an interventionist love, a love that is guarding of people's dignity and lives and the value of their lives and the experience of their lives, that holds that sacrosanct. And then a related despair that I felt, and to some degree still feel, about, I suppose, the ways, the almost the impossibility of addressing this in a way that is going to shift our society in a different way. And I use society and I use all of these words in very unacademic and very very I suppose inexact ways. But what I wanted to get from writing these poems was at the very least, to put on witness some things, and also to put on witness the fact that these are also things that are changeable, that are, contingent on the ways in which we allow our society to operate, contingent on the things that we do in our day-to-day lives. I'm not too sure if I'm addressing this well. I suppose this is why I wrote the poems.
Yes.
Because that for me was the only way I could really express these intertwined, entangled, very difficult feelings, while also not getting on a soapbox like I've just done for the past 3 minutes answering a question.
No, it's fun because you're leading us. I mean, by thinking aloud, you're leading us deeper into the poems, and that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jacques, for getting us started. Since there's not another hand yet, I'll ask a question. I'm curious, you obviously write poetry and then also edit and publish poetry, but then also you're a fiction writer as well. And what draws you to the different forms of writing, or like what space do you need to be in for each one, or what are the differences for you?
From the beginning, I've always written in, I suppose, as many different ways as I can. For me, it isn't so much about fictionality or form or genre. It's really about what is I suppose it's much more, I suppose, organic than that. I've been asked this question a lot because since I started writing seriously, I've always written poems and some scholarship and some journalism, though I don't do that anymore, as well as working on my fiction on the side. I suppose the easiest answer is that it's really just a feel. How does a visual artist necessarily know from the beginning if a piece will be, what format a piece will take, what materials will be used, what's the framing, what's the composition. In some respects, these decisions are both practical and also a bit woo-woo, in that I often sit down trying to engage, I suppose, with some sort of subject, some sort of feeling, some sort of I suppose, scholarly idea, and where the writing goes is where it goes. So I don't, generally I make a decision about, is this true, or is this going to be presented as fiction, or is this going to be presented as nonfiction? And then from there, some lines might, lines often, most of my writing starts with a few sentences that come either organically or come from trying to find an expression for an image or an expression of a feeling. Then from those opening sentences, or at least from the beginnings of these sentences, or the beginnings of these words, I try to get an idea of, whether these words have a internal rhythm to them. Do they have an internal rhyme? Do they have the potential for different forms of writing in which their inherent qualities as words or as sentences will be best lent? But also, in another sense, poetry is great because you're able to pose questions that are often left unasked and are asked by the reader within themselves. I find poetry is a not far more, but often a more contemplative, abstract space where the literature or words or sentences function much like they do our own thoughts. And oftentimes our thoughts are only partially graspable or only partially able to be put in touch with other thoughts. Sometimes they're fragmentary or whatever. So I enjoy poetry for the, I suppose, the not inherent ambiguity. I think that depends on your poetics, but for me, there's an inherent ambiguity. in the way that I write poems, which for me is attractive. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Specializing in the long answers today.
Definitely, but we love it. Anybody else who wants to ask something? You can always unmute yourself if I'm not seeing you. Wave at me or something. Stuart.
Hi. I wondered to what extent you envisaged a book like this back in 2016, or was it the result of continuing preoccupations over the years? Thanks.
Hi, Stuart. Thanks. It's really nice to see you. So, yes, pre-existing occupations, definitely. But at the same time, I think in 2016, I think 2017, I had this kind of jokey idea for what my next poetry book would be. It would be called It's Your Boy. And it would be about the construction of like a poetic self, and that kind of jokey, very avant-garde way in which like a lot of young British poets are doing things now, where they create a mythos of the self and then things kind of go from there. But mine was supposed to be a bit of a satire of that. And I started writing these poems kind of satirizing my own thoughts about what it means to be a poet, to write poetry. And then I realized, I think halfway through writing these poems, that they weren't ironic at all. They weren't satirical at all. I was actually just writing about me, which editors, to be fair to them, saw right through. I didn't see it myself. I got so many, rejections from publishers and editors and stuff saying, oh, your poetry is very, it's nice, it's funny, but it's very solipsistic. And I was thinking to myself, oh, how is it solipsistic? But I was being so solipsistic that I couldn't even see my own solipsism. That's it. And then I kind of thought, well, how am I going to break out of this? Which I'm not really too sure how I knew I was going to. So then I started writing around these poems with, I suppose, more complicated and more deliberate acts of writing, getting towards poems that were more narratively driven. But then those didn't work. Those were more like poems that were also short stories, and there were bad short stories as well as being bad poems. And then I must have drafted, Stuart, like 60 to 70 poems that I thought might have been in this book over the years. And I leaned very heavily on my friends who are, editors and poets, to try and give me an idea of which ones are great, are good, or okay, or, I should work on them more. But then I think since the pandemic and since, the stuff that happened in Durban last year, and I had some medical leave from work, and for a year, I was very sick last year. And during this time, I was reading a lot of Pessoa, and I was beginning to feel feelings that were more of a synthesis of these two preoccupations. And then I saw where the poems would begin to fit in. But the short answer is, it's almost entire. I didn't like my last book. Let me put it that way. It sold all right. I think it sold 500 copies, which was great. People think it's funny. I still sometimes think it's funny, but it didn't really feel like I was really writing poems that were getting close to what I felt or what I thought, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, I think, but now that this book is published, I'm kind of like, no, I hate this book too. I think it's just, I have about as an unhealthy relationship with my poems as I do with myself. Let's put it that way.
Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else who wants to ask something or comment on anything?
I mean, anything.
It's a free for all.
It's a free for all. And if you don't want to ask, you can put it in the chat.
Yeah, you're welcome to type something up.
How's it? I have a question.
Oh, hello.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. There are puppies running around all over the place. Sorry. Hi.
Hi.
But I have a question about, maybe it's a bit nerdy, but I've increasingly been thinking about the distance between the speaker of the poem and the writer of the poem, and how often we're asked to account for that distance, even if we don't necessarily think and subscribe to that distance, even if we don't necessarily play around in that like very hyper ironic space that like the UK school is moving in right now.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, but like I'm kind of lamenting the loss of It's Your Boy, like even if it's not like a chapbook, like I need that. Like I need that sounds like the exact kind of like, especially because as poets now in this sort of like neo post-pandemic neo-fascist dispensation where there's like this strange obsession with the identity and disidentification, that this question of like the distance between the speaker and the poet is like really interesting. Like there's an interesting space there that we can play there. So I don't know, maybe this is just me waving the flag to be like, if there's still space for It's Your Boy to be published, even as like a singular reader, like I'd be down like so much.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I mean, I think the difficulty with that is that, I mean, not difficulty. How should I address this? I suppose over the past few years, I have become more aware of the difference between identity and identification. So, and I suppose with me shelving It's Your Boy for a while, I was trying to figure out for myself the answer to that question. What about, you know, is the speaker in this poem that I'm writing really myself, or is it something else? Or is it someone else within my psyche, or is it some other synonym of those flavors? Or what is it I'm actually doing here? Because we are living in a kind of time of, I don't want to say like identity fascism, but we're getting into this sort of very interesting stage whereby the politics maybe that I subscribed to about 5 to 7 years ago have been so I suppose appropriated by forces that I do not really subscribe to. There's a corporatization of identity. There is a very strange entanglement and what's the word? Sort of infiltration of the way in which identity and politics were being used, at least in South Africa. And I just couldn't really, I felt very uncomfortable working in these kinds of spaces. So I thought, well, instead of writing about like an idealized me for like humor, it felt more meaningful and more political for me to actually put myself, you know, my actual thoughts, whether or not, and I don't identify necessarily with the speaker or the I or even the you in these poems, because often I use you instead of I. It's just a tick of how I speak. And I was interested in how that would play out. And I feel there's something more interesting happening that when I'm actually sincerely interrogating myself than there was in me trying. I think it would have been different if It's Your Boy was really about me, but it wasn't. It was about some other thing, but maybe I'll come back to it one day. I think, yeah. again, these are very. I suppose I should say that a few months ago I had a bit of a turnaround in my health, and it was based on me changing my thought patterns and changing the ways in which I was thinking, having the space in my head that was conducive to having good, non-damaging thoughts to myself. And so it's difficult for me to actually go back into this space because in many ways I'm not this person anymore. So poetically, I've actually done the same thing I was intending to do in the first place. I'm writing about myself in this other way. In fact, maybe either way I was going to come out of it in the same way. The process happened within myself, which I suppose is what the book is about. I'm sorry. I will cringe when I listen back to this recording because thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's awesome. Awesome question. Anybody else who wants to pop in with something? Going once. Going twice. No?
Sold.
Sold. Any final words, Nick?
Thanks. Thank you to everybody for taking time out of your evening to listen to me read. I am, being a publisher of these books and stuff, it's made me really be. I've had to create a kind of gratitude within myself because I know how relatively small our community of readers is and what an investment of time and imagination and thanks again, Aaron. And I just, I just want to say thanks to everybody who supports Uhlanga, buys our books, reads the poems, everything like that. I mean, the pandemic really foregrounded to me how important it is to have spaces like this and to have people to speak with about our poems and to read our poems with and talk about our poems and talk about writing. I know it seems a little bit, it might be a bit mawkish, but just, thanks. And I think next year I'm going to be taking a bit of a break from publishing. I'm tired, unfortunately, after 8 years. So I think I'm going to have to take a little break. And at the end of, I suppose, 40 books, I think I've published over the last 8 years in various kinds of poetry and kinds of writing and kinds of people. My main feeling is just gratitude. So thank you to you all. It's really nice to have this.
Thank you. Yeah, I think writing is about connecting, and this is a space for that. And I think we all feel so much gratitude for all the work you've done with Uhlanga and giving all these different people places to have books that come out. I'm not the only poet who's got many Uhlanga books, and they're all favorites. So thank you for that dedication you've done to the craft.
Thank you very much.
So we're going to take a 5-minute break and then we'll have an open mic. So those of you who want to hang around with us and read some of your own poems, we'd love to hear them as well. It's now 8:28 on my clock. So I think around 33 past-ish, we'll be back here. Thank you again, Nick.
Hi, sorry, hello.
Yes.
Question,
You muted yourself.
okay, there we go. Sorry. If you're not going to do publishing next year, are you going to hand it over to someone else?
No. It's a one-person operation, and it's I apart from are incredibly capable and dedicated the people who help me. I commission, I design, I do the programs. So I think if there was someone I could, yeah, in fact, I don't know, but for this time, no, unfortunately.
Maybe after a year.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, look, it's my intention to carry on, but in order to carry on, I need to take a break, I think. I also have a PhD to finish, so that's the main problem, I'd say.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. So we'll be back here 35 past.